Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many old friends and new friends and those who are looking forward to an exciting afternoon. It's wonderful. I'm Eileen Makovich, the director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and I can honestly say that even when Abraham Lincoln may or may not have dined alone, the crowd never looked more wonderful than you do here today. Please make it a habit. Very quickly, I just want to tell you a one short sentence about how all this began. There is a professor at UIS who is seated in the front row next to his wife Dorothy, and he said, oh, this is quite several months ago. I want to make sure that we do something extensive about Billy Flourville. And I was standing there quiet thinking, oh my, and the next person on my left was Catherine Harris, and she said, of course. I also can tell you that Angela Wynand was also in the group. It happened that everyone got together, that Catherine organized and organized and organized, and I can see many of you here today who are part of Catherine's not only extensive organization, but ability to say, of course you have to do this. So I'm delighted that you're here. I want to tell you one more brief word about this idea, which is called investigating history. You'll learn an awful lot today about Billy Flourville, but there is much that you will quickly learn needs to be learned about him and about many, many other people in central Illinois and beyond. Many people about whom we know too little, but are part of our shared history. What we hope to accomplish with this occasional series called Investigating History is to have all of us participate in the glorious, exceptional part of history, which is doing original research. You'll find a lot of material here, primary documents. You can work together with your middle school and high school students with the core curriculum on studying things together. And mostly, you can come to the library where our collections are extraordinary. They could, however, be better. And so I hope you will think about contributing to our collections. Today is for Billy Flourville, and my special thanks to Catherine.
My name is Catherine Harris, and I'm so glad all of y'all are here. This is indeed a wonderful turnout. I am just overwhelmed, and I thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule today to come and learn more, or perhaps something that you didn't know at all about William Flourville. As we get started, though, I have some people that I need to acknowledge. Eileen mentioned Catherine's committee. Well, anyway, all of those who were on Catherine's committee, as it were, please stand. We can start right here with Sarah Watson. Where's Candy Trees? Vandella Brown? Candy Trees, Orville Ewing, Babs Dickerman. Sam and Angela and I, of course, were on the committee, but it takes all of us to make this work. And we've had lots of support and enthusiasm shown by everyone who's been involved with this project. To get started, though, I would ask the person who had this idea, to which Catherine said, of course, to come forward and just tell us a little bit. Dr. Matthew Holden, he's from UIS, about why do we care about Billy, or why should we? Bob Davis, did I acknowledge you on the committee? I am now acknowledging Bob Davis and Pat, because they go together. All right, so Matthew, would you come and just say a few words about our program and how we got here and why you think it's important, and so should we?
Thank you, Catherine. My name is Matthew Holden, and I am in the Political Science Department at the University of Illinois, Springfield. And the pertinence for this afternoon is that when I was brought to UIS, like many appointment documents, I have lots of obligations, but the one that bears here is that the appointment letter says that I am supposed to engage in public affairs clearly related to the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And the connection here then is that I've had to educate myself in the things that Lincoln historians know. They are a well-informed and highly ideological tribe. They dispute everything, and they decimate everybody who shows up. I had to safeguard myself against being decimated by making it clear that I'm not and never will be a Lincoln historian. I haven't got that capacity, but I have certain other capacities. And so I have tried to think more than anything else about a series of seminars that we have run bearing fundamentally on the Lincoln presidency. I have a simple proposition. Whatever else one may say about Abraham Lincoln, the most important single thing about Abraham Lincoln was that he had the authority of being president of the United States. Whatever else one may say, that is the key. And in that connection, I discover amongst the Lincoln historians that the connection to African Americans is remarkably underdeveloped. And once upon a time, I asked a very distinguished historian about this person called Billy the Barber. And he looked at me with an air somewhere between dismissal and pity. As to say, Billy the Barber, who is he and why do I care, since I am a very distinguished Lincoln historian and I have done lots of other important things. And so I then began to think about that and learned a great deal, some of which will appear from what I understand about the program, since I have nothing to do with the program, in the things that will occur this afternoon. I will say then that in my work in UIS, for whatever time I may choose to remain here, and as you know, my hair gets grayer and grayer, and my bones stiffer and stiffer, and I'm not sure how much longer that will be. But by the time we come to the end, there are two other things I want to see happen, and I will say a word then about how Fleurville fits into that. Number one, I want to have a really major inquiry on the Lincoln legacy and its international side. The other major inquiry I want to have is on the Lincoln legacy and its relation in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries to people of color. Having said that, Fleurville is the connection to start for me in investigating this part of history. Fleurville is the connection because Billy the Barber was, in fact, as you will learn in one way or the other, an entrepreneur. Billy the Barber was not someone to be taken lightly, but a Lincoln client. There were many other things about that. And I will touch on this by saying a couple of other things. You will learn that the man was Haitian by background, and I will use that merely to make the point that when Lincoln became president, the two countries of color that had never had diplomatic recognition from the United States were Liberia and Haiti. And that opens up many things to come. There are other things to be said about that. We move all the way down to think about Springfield, Fleurville and the Fleurville family. At least opens up the question of all sorts of family histories and what they mean here. And so that is some of what I've been puzzling about, wondering about, and so on, and that I hope to learn more about in this afternoon's program. So thank you so very much, Catherine, and thank you all for tolerating me.
I thank you all so very much for coming. And just on a personal note, as I and we were working on this project, I got in touch with another part of the Fleurville family. They live in Oklahoma. and his name is Gary Collins, and Rollins, rather, and his wife is Grace? Pam. Anyway, I've been in touch with them by phone and email, and they are just so sorry that they could not be here today. But this has been really an exciting experience for me to get to know more about William Florville through those relations that I've developed with the family here in Springfield and the family that's in Oklahoma. And I believe I talked on the phone to a relation who's from Ohio who knows Gary. So it's a big family. At any rate, now I would like to, I think I'll have Glennette Tilly Turner just stand for the moment. Glennette is the author of Billy the Barber's Mirror, Reflecting on an Untold Story, and I think that is a very apt title because this will cause you to reflect and think about the relationship that William Florville had with the to-be president and how all of that came about. And I encourage you to buy the book so you can have it, and Glennette will sign it for you. Glennette Tilly Turner, she is from Wheaton, Illinois. She is an historian. Some of you are probably familiar with her other book, one of her other books, The Underground Railroad in Illinois. And she is an authority on that particular topic. And I thank you very much for being here today, Glennette. So with no further ado, I'm going to have Dr. Sam Wheeler come and give a little biographical background on William Florville. Dr. Sam?
Thank you, Catherine. It's good to see a full multi-purpose room here today. This is a fantastic turnout. For too many years, William Florville's life has been overlooked. That's a shame for a lot of different reasons. Florville has an incredibly compelling personal story. That personal story is the story of a Haitian-born orphan who found his way to America, who built a successful business, raised a large family, and gave back to his community. We can say, after we talk a little bit about who William Florville was, Springfield was a better place because William Florville lived here. That personal story alone is worthy of examination. His story is a uniquely American success story. It has the power to inspire us. But even more than that, Florville's life was a life of historical significance. His life gives us a window into the African American community in Lincoln, Springfield, a terribly neglected topic by historians traditionally. His life also helps us to understand the space that African Americans occupied in antebellum America. And by getting to know William Florville, we can get to know Abraham Lincoln a little better. So let's start at the beginning. There is very little that we know about William Florville's early life. He was born in about 1806 in Haiti, and Haiti has a fascinating history. It's the only nation in the world established because of a successful slave revolt. After independence, there was a long, protracted struggle to see who would control Haiti. Bloody wars ensued, and tens of thousands of Haitians fled that violence. Many of them went to New Orleans. They helped contribute to that unique culture that we know in New Orleans today. When Florville was 15 or 16, he became one of those refugees. He fled Haiti with his godmother. We don't know what happened to his parents. but they fled to Baltimore, Maryland, another popular place for Haitian immigrants at that time to flee to. She died shortly after they got to Baltimore. Now, think about this, a 16-year-old boy, an orphan in a strange country. The Orphans Court stepped in Baltimore, and Flourville was apprenticed to a barber, where he learned the barbering trade. A little bit of context. In antebellum America, black barbers dominated the barbering profession. The act of barbering in the 19th century meant cutting hair as well as shaving men's faces. Native-born whites thought that sort of work was beneath them. White customers in antebellum America expected to go to a black barber. They expected to receive deferential treatment. And they paid for both the service and the experience of being served in these barber shops. And barbering was one of the few occupations in which blacks could attain some level of economic freedom. Some black barbers who owned their barber shop clawed their way to the middle class, and they became prominent individuals in their communities. So after learning this profession in Baltimore, Flourville went west. He first went to New Orleans. It's a very logical decision. There was a large Haitian population in New Orleans at that time. But what else did New Orleans have? Slavery. Slave auctions were held on street corners in New Orleans where human beings were sold like livestock. And Flourville, remember, was born a free man. But in places like New Orleans, he had reason to fear for his freedom. History is filled full of examples of free men being arrested, being accused of being runaway slaves with no real recourse to prove their status as free people. They were enslaved. Flourville didn't linger long in New Orleans. He moved north. By the fall of 1831, William Flourville was in Illinois. We're told, according to legend, that he made it as far as New Salem before he was broke. As he's approaching the village, a strange-looking guy carrying an axe, wearing a red flannel shirt, came emerging from the wilderness, and the two struck up a conversation. The man, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. Flourville tells him that he's a barber, but he's dead broke. He's trying to make it to Springfield. And Lincoln tells him to bring your scissors. Come on into the village. He introduces him to the folks at the Rutledge Tavern, and Flourville spends the rest of the evening giving out haircuts. Earns enough money to where in the morning he can go back on his way to Springfield. I don't know if that story's true, but I hope it is. It's too good not to be true. So Flourville moved to Springfield, a small little town of a few hundred people. In 1832, he opened up the first barber shop in Springfield. He erected the first barber pole Springfield ever had. He soon expanded his business to include clothes cleaning as part of that business. And in July 1832, he took out an advertisement in the Sangamo Journal, the local newspaper. That's one of the primary documents that we have circulated around here today. I hope everybody gets a chance to look at one of those primary documents that we've passed around for you. These primary documents are some of the pieces that helps bring William Flourville's life into sharper focus for us. But I wanted to read this document to you today. This is an advertisement he put in the paper. The first part, it's pretty straightforward business advertisement. Flourville writes, "In addition to my business as a barber, I carry on the business of scouring coats and pantaloons, which I do in the best manner." But then that advertisement gets pretty creative. Flourville was undoubtedly an educated man, no doubt about it. But he was a man of color who was competing for white customers in 1830. For the rest of this advertisement, he adopts a much different voice. He adopts a deferential voice. the voice that whites were familiar with from imagined black dialect, from antebellum minstrel shows. And he finishes off this advertisement with a poem in this dialect. I renovates old clothes and gives 'em such glossy hue that you'd believe almost I makes 'em all quite fresh and new. The chin I scrapes, as you well know, and cuts the hair as I used to do. Flourville signed that first advertisement Billy, and for the rest of his life, he was known to his customers around town as Billy the Barber. 2 days after this advertisement appeared in the local paper, he got married. We have a copy of that marriage license here in the library. Maybe we'll get to see it later on. His bride was Phoebe Roundtree. She was a former slave from Kentucky, freed at the age of 15 along with her mother and 7 of her siblings. The couple raised 5 children here in town. And Flourville's barbershop was the means of survival for that family. Through the 1830s, he cultivated a clientele. Those advertisements in the newspapers that we've circulated around, I love them because those give us an insight into Flourville's business. I'll point out just a couple things. Business owners in the crowd. Who owns a business here in the crowd today? How many we got? Many business owners will tell us that location is everything. Flourville knew that perfectly. Those advertisements, he moved around a lot where his actual business was located. Fire destroyed a lot of his businesses. But he always had his business near the town square, near the state capitol. That tells us about the clientele that William Flourville was trying to attract to his business. Close to the state capitol, Flourville was looking to attract prominent white men into his establishment, state legislators, lawyers, judges, shopkeepers. Those advertisements also often brag about how cosmopolitan his shop is. He talks about the paintings and the fine etchings that are decorated his shop. Again, that's a business decision to attract an upper-class clientele. And the last thing I like about those advertisements, just like today, 19th century barbershops were places where there was a good deal of socializing. You can imagine one of the topics of conversation going on in Flourville's barbershop is politics. Those state legislators and lawyers, just like today, they like to talk a little bit about politics. Flourville's advertisements often referenced upcoming elections, talked about individual candidates by name, talked about political issues. But what's fascinating when you look at those advertisements, he does so in a nonpartisan way. He doesn't want to alienate a Democrat, a Whig, or a Republican. He wants all their business. Just 4 years into his business, Flourville began investing his profits from the barbershop into real estate. He acquired at least a dozen different pieces of property. At one point, he owned virtually a whole city block. Washington Street, between 8th and 9th. That's some good real estate today. The north side of the street is the Prairie Capital Convention Center. South side of the street is the county parking lot. He also acquired land outside of Springfield. I think our next speaker may talk a little bit about that. By looking at census records, we know that by the 1850s, William Flourville, by any standard, had reached the middle class in Springfield. By 1860, he owned, his personal value was valued at $2,000. That's the mark of the middle class in 1860. Barbering is a profession. I would argue, I would encourage students here, give it a look. There's all sorts of opportunities to study the barbering profession in some more detail. It was one of the few roads that African Americans in the middle class could take to the middle class, and William Flourville is our example, our Springfield local example of an individual who had done just that. One of the most admirable traits that Flourville had was his interest in philanthropy. He had a knack for making money, but he also had a belief that you had to do something positive with that. Two of his favorite causes were religion and education. He was a Catholic. There's a tradition in town that says the first Catholic Mass was said in Floresville's home. In the 1850s, he donated very liberally to Catholic causes in town, helping to build the church. He also donated to other denominations. He seemed to believe that a church, no matter what the denomination, was good for this growing community. As far as education goes, we said Floresville was an educated man. That's clear when you look at his letters. His wife, a former slave, never learned to read or write. They educated all 5 of their children. In fact, their son, Varvel, attended college. He went to Knox College, founded in 1837 by abolitionists that didn't discriminate based upon color. And then in the 1840s, our advertisements show Floresville, along with another barber in town, were advertising for a schoolmaster. They were looking to establish a school for black children here in Springfield. 1860, of course, was a momentous year for the nation. Springfield was no exception. Lincoln was elected president. Floresville gave him his last haircut before they went off. During the Civil War, Floresville wrote Lincoln a letter, which we have as a primary document we're circulating. Wrote him towards the end of 1863. He starts off by congratulating him for having the courage to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But if you ever get a chance, read the rest of that letter. It's a conversational letter. It's a talk between 2 individuals who've known each other for more than 30 years. He says, "I'm sorry to hear about the death of your son, Willie." And then he talks about who Willie was. It's clear that Floresville had met Willie, knew that he was a smart, very charismatic little boy. He says, "Tell Tad," Lincoln's other son, "that his dog's doing just fine here in town." When the Lincolns left, they had to leave their dog here. He didn't get to jump on the train and go to Washington with them. He sort of ends the letter by saying, "It'd be nice to see you again," but he sort of feared that he would never get the chance, and he, of course, was right. I'll also add that the Civil War didn't miss the Floresville home. That son that had attended college, Varvel, he served in some capacity during the Civil War on the staff of John McClernand. Served for about 2 years, came back to Springfield, and in 1864 passed away after a illness. He is buried today in the Catholic Calvary Cemetery adjacent to Oak Ridge. And the next year, Floresville, we're told, took the Lincoln assassination quite hard. In fact, his family said he was really never the same after the assassination. The nation mourned Lincoln with the most elaborate funeral in American history. And according to family tradition, Floresville was asked to be part of the formal funeral procession, to ride in a carriage along with perhaps some of Lincoln's other Springfield associates. But according to family tradition, he turned down the offer. And he said, "I would rather march with my own people," meaning the other African Americans in town who had the very last spot at the very end of that long funeral procession. I haven't found evidence to corroborate that family tradition, but at any rate, that's the case. Almost 3 years to the day of Lincoln's death, Floresville was struck by a short illness. We have his last will and testament that he filled out during that last illness. And on April 13th, 1868, Floresville passed away at the age of 61. We're told it was a large funeral, but like many African Americans during this time period, the newspaper that he spent his life advertising in all the time marked his passing with a mere half dozen lines in the paper. Very matter of fact, passed away this date. Today, Floresville is buried next to his son in Calvary Cemetery. The rest of the family is buried adjacent at Oak Ridge. So today, Floresville is not often mentioned in traditional Lincoln biographies. He's not mentioned at all in William Herndon's biography of Lincoln. He's not mentioned at all in Albert Beveridge's 2-volume treatment of Lincoln. He's mentioned only in passing in Benjamin Thomas's work. a little bit more prominently in David Donald's biography. He's mentioned in the passage about colonization. And David Donald says about Flourville in relation to that, oh yeah, Lincoln did know some African Americans in Springfield, such as his barber, William Flourville, but they certainly wouldn't have talked about a topic like colonization. Lincoln wouldn't have known what his stance was on a big political issue like that. For the most part, scholars have neglected Flourville, and in cases like Donald, I think they failed to think very deeply about him. And I think that's a mistake. Flourville's worthy of further study. At the very least, he offers us a window into that African American community. That's a topic that's been unexplored, if not for the really pioneering work of Dick Hart, who couldn't be with us here today. Dick Hart tells us that when Lincoln arrived in Springfield in 1837, there were just 26 African Americans in town, 6 of which were slaves. By 1861, the black population had grown to 234. More than half of those folks had been born in the South, many of whom were former slaves. Dick Hart tells us, if you're a Lincoln scholar, ask what impact that population had on the man who went on to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. I would also say, by doing a little bit of research on that community, historians might find things that shock them. For instance, Donald told us that Flourville was in no position to let politicians like Lincoln know what they thought about issues like colonization. It's not true. On Lincoln's birthday in 1858, African Americans met in Springfield to talk about colonization. They passed a series of resolutions. Those resolutions got printed in the local newspaper. They said, we don't like colonization. America is our home too. They specifically said, we don't support the efforts of the Illinois Colonization Society, a group that Lincoln supported. Of course, as president, Lincoln continued to support colonization. He even gave his blessing to a disastrous attempt to colonize Haiti during his presidency. But by the end of his life, Lincoln was no longer calling for colonization. He was now calling for greater rights for some African Americans, including the right to vote. Lincoln believed that black men could become productive citizens. And perhaps the president came to that conclusion in part because he had faith in men like his Springfield barber, William Flourville, who he had known and respected for more than 30 years. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sam, for those remarks about William Flourville. And at this time, we're going to make a change in the order of our program, and we are going to entertain you now with the very first premiere of a play right here in beautiful downtown Springfield. It's called A Last Conversation Between Billy the Barber and Abraham Lincoln. It is an imagined conversation adapted from the book Billy the Barber's Mirror, reflecting on an untold story, and it's by Glennette Tilly Turner, and we are very honored today to have it presented right here for your enjoyment. So, off we go. It's the winter of 1860. William Flourville, known as Billy the Barber, is about to open his elegant barber shop, the first one in Springfield, that is appropriately called the Palace.
Good morning, Billy.
Good morning, Mr. Lincoln.
How are you today?
I am fine, sir, and you?
Tolerable.
Have a seat, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Lincoln, I've known you long enough to know when there's something troubling your heart.
Yes, I expect you have. Oh, I've been thinking, Billy. If I win this presidential election, I'll have to say goodbye to all my friends here, including you.
I'll never forget when we first met on the banks of the Sangamon River in New Salem back in 1831.
Yes. Well, we struck up an acquaintance almost immediately. You told me you'd been in New Orleans. You was a barber and working your way to Springfield.
And you arranged for me to cut hair at the Rutledge Tavern boarding house. You know, in just 2 days, I'd earned enough money to continue my journey.
That's right. By the time I got to Springfield, a few years later, 37, I heard you established already this fine place, which has just about become my second home.
You know, we've swapped many a story over the years, Mr. Lincoln. Like when you told me about piloting that flatboat to New Orleans.
Oh, yes. You told me a few about your origins also.
Mm-hmm.
You were a free-born man down Haiti way. In fact, I remember you telling me about some Haitians. What was it? 545, 50 or so of them folk come up here to help out in our revolution, fought with George Washington. The Battle of Savannah, I think, when we finally got our independence from Great Britain.
That is correct. That is a little-known chapter in history. But speaking of history, you've made quite a lot of history yourself. Like when you suggested moving the Illinois state capital from Vandalia to Springfield.
I reckon that was historical, right?
It sure was. But the thing that meant the most to me, Mr. Lincoln, was you being a lawyer.
Well, that was a hard-fought battle, getting to be a lawyer. But you know, it was a privilege to be able to help you, sir. You're a good businessman.
Thank you, sir.
And I was glad I could help you get a square deal on some of your real estate investments.
Thank you. I must say, you're looking mighty presidential, Mr. Lincoln. I'm going to hate to see you go, but Springfield's loss will be the nation's gain.
Well, I won't be going anywhere if I don't get elected.
You'd certainly have my vote if blacks were allowed to vote. You know, I look forward to the day when every grown person has that franchise. But in the meantime, I hope those who can vote have the good sense to vote for you.
So do I, Billy. So do I. Good work.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. What do you think of these whiskers?
What makes you ask, Mr. Lincoln?
I got a letter. I ought to read it to you, a man of letters. Come from a little lady out in New York. My 11 years old, by the name of Grace Padell.
Okay.
I'll read it to you. She thought I might look a little bit better with some chin whiskers. This is what she said. I've got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway, and if you let your whiskers grow, I will try to get the rest of them to vote for you. She goes on to say, you would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. And then, this is where I'd like your opinion. She says, all the ladies lack whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. Now, my friend, they pay you good money to tell gentlemen the truth about their appearance. So I'd like to know your opinion.
So that is why you have started growing a beard after all these years. Well, Mr. Lincoln, I will keep it trimmed so that it gives a good impression to anyone who sees it. I think little Miss Grace had a good idea.
Now, it can't be said for certain that Grace Bedell's letter led Lincoln to grow a beard, but by the end of January 1861, Lincoln posed for his first picture wearing a beard. And undoubtedly, William Florville was the first barber to ever trim Abraham Lincoln's famous beard. I do want to bring to your attention also the material that is on display against the wall. Dr. Sam referenced some of it, but Mary Beth Roderick, where did she disappear to? Oh, stand up, Mary Beth. A lot of the material that is on the table, particularly the photocopies and some photographs that are on the table, those all belong to Mary Beth Roderick, and she was very kind to share those and bring them here today. So before you go home, please take an opportunity to look at those items. They too are glimpses into William Florville and his family also, and I thank Mary Beth for doing that. Now, one of the things that Dr. Sam alluded to in his remarks was William Florville's business acumen, his real estate, his entrepreneurial spirit, and all of that. And so now we are going to hear from John Lupton, who's going to talk about some of Mr. Lincoln's interactions with Billy the Barber on a legal side. John is the director of the Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, and that is indeed a mouthful. And he has been working with that organization, and I would like to just thank him for working with us, particularly Eileen, and the library and museum, in working on the historical representations we've had concerning Mary Surratt and the trial, and Mary Lincoln's insanity trial, and one about habeas corpus and the Mormons. Was there another one?
We're working on the fourth one,
And that one would be?
which will be, we're going to examine some school segregation cases in Alton that occurred at the turn of the 20th century.
All right. But right now, we're going to learn about William Florville's legal interactions with Mr. Lincoln. I bet you didn't know that Mr. Lincoln was Billy's lawyer.
Thanks, Catherine. Abraham Lincoln's relationship with William Florville has long been recognized as a genuine friendship between the lawyer and politician from Springfield, Illinois, and the African-American barber here in Springfield. But this relationship extended beyond just this simple friendship. Lincoln and Florville also had a legal client relationship. This client-lawyer arrangement had lasted at least 14 years that we know of, from 1847 to 1860. Lincoln represented Florville in 3 different lawsuits and operated as a legal agent for Florville in a non-litigated transaction. But let me just explain a little bit about my background. Before I became the director of the Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, I worked with a project called the Lincoln Legal Papers for a number of years, and we traveled all over the state and all over the country to look for all traces of Abraham Lincoln's law practice. So I've done a lot of research into Abraham Lincoln's law practice, which led me into this natural progression of then going to the Illinois Supreme Court. But let me put Lincoln's law practice just into a little bit of perspective because I think it further illustrates this mutual respect between the two. Lincoln had a huge legal career. We have uncovered documentation for approximately 5,100 cases over the course of a 25-year law practice. And when the Papers of Abraham Lincoln, which became, or excuse me, the Lincoln Legal Papers became the Papers of Abraham Lincoln, when we were still working on our publications in the 1990s, we actually thought it would be helpful to put Lincoln's caseload into a better context. So we examined all of the cases in Sangamon County from 1836 to 1860, creating a database of every case, whether Lincoln was involved with it or not. Basically to see how Lincoln's caseload compared with other attorneys. And not surprisingly, we found that Lincoln by far had one of the largest caseloads in the county. Now, how does this relate to Flourville? Well, I should also point out that Springfield probably had more attorneys than any other Illinois city with the exception of Chicago. So Flourville had numerous choices when it came to finding a lawyer in Springfield to represent him. He chose Lincoln. And Flourville had one case, just one case in the Sangamon County Circuit Court. Lincoln had over 2,500 cases in the Sangamon County Circuit Court, averaging over 100 per year. But still, Flourville chose this very busy attorney, Abraham Lincoln. I think this says something. There were three, as I said earlier, there were three known cases in which Lincoln represented Flourville. The first case was a simple justice of the peace case in Sangamon County in 1847, and we don't know whether Flourville was the plaintiff or the defendant, or even what the suit was about. Justice of the peace cases typically involved a debt under $100, so it's probably safe to say that this was probably the issue here, but we don't know who sued whom or who even won the case. All we know is that Lincoln had represented Flourville, and we know this information from a fee book that Lincoln and Herndon had kept in the late 1840s, and that's all it says, was that they represented Flourville in a JP case. The second case is the one case that Flourville had in the Sangamon County Circuit Court, and this occurred in 1849, right after Lincoln returned from his 2-year term in Congress. Now, in this case, a man by the name of Joseph Stockdale gave Flourville a promissory note, or an IOU, for $100, and he secured the note with a mortgage on a town lot here in Springfield. And the lot, just FYI, is actually where the Bank of Springfield is, at the next block here, where the Big Horace Man parking lot. That's where the lot was. So he secured this note with a mortgage. Stockdale later secured this same lot to Grover Ayers on a $700 promissory note. So when Stockdale's note to Flourville came due first, and Stockdale did not pay it, so Flourville retained Lincoln and sued Stockdale and Ayers to foreclose the mortgage. Now, neither Stockdale nor Ayers had appeared in court, which resulted in a default judgment, so Lincoln won the case for his client Flourville. After the judgment, Flourville assigned his winnings, or not his winnings, but the judgment of the case, to Ayers. So most likely, even though we don't know this for a fact, probably what happened is that Ayers paid the $100 debt that Stockdale owed to Flourville, and then just assumed the mortgage for the land. The third case occurred in McLean County. There were 3 Bloomington citizens who laid off an addition to the town of Bloomington. One of them was a man by the name of David Prickett, and he agreed to give Flourville 4 lots in exchange for shaving him during his lifetime. Well, Flourville lost the deed, and he wasn't able to record it with the recorder's office in McLean County. So Flourville again retained Abraham Lincoln and sued the 3 gentlemen, and this was a friendly suit because Lincoln wrote the defendants in advance and basically told them what is happening. So this was a friendly suit to have the lots properly conveyed to Flourville. The gentlemen failed to appear, which is probably what they intended to do, and then Flourville obtained the deed to the 4 lots. And Lincoln paid the court costs out of his own pocket for this case. Now, the last legal relationship between Flourville and Lincoln was Lincoln acting as an agent for Flourville. As I noted, Flourville owned these 4 lots in Bloomington, and Lincoln actually paid the real estate taxes for Flourville. In February of 1860, Lincoln wrote a letter to a colleague in Bloomington saying that he had forgotten to pay the taxes the last time he was in Bloomington, and asked his colleague to pay the taxes on Lincoln's behalf. And then Lincoln would repay him later. And Lincoln's colleague wrote him back saying he happily did so, paying all of $10 in real estate taxes for 4 town lots. So Lincoln's respect for Floraville as an individual is really apparent in these simple legal transactions. Lincoln probably, we don't know this for a fact, but he probably did this work pro bono. We know that he paid the court costs in one case, probably paid the court costs for the other case, and we know that Lincoln paid his real estate taxes for him. So while the attorney-client relationship between Lincoln and Floraville was quite small, it does suggest that there was much more to this personal relationship between the two than simply being acquaintances and this Barber client relationship as well. Thank you.
So this is Glennette Tilly Turner, and she's going to read from her book and probably talk a little bit about how all of this came to pass.
Well, it is my delight to be here. Thank you so much for coming. I've just been fascinated by Billy the Barber ever since my mom told me about him. Mama grew up in Springfield, and although our family lived in the South as I was growing up, whenever she would hear the word Illinois or Springfield, she would just repeat it with such love in her heart that I just knew this was, just really so meaningful to her. But one of her fondest memories from childhood was when she spoke of participating in an organization called the Culture Club. On Sunday afternoons, Mama and her parents were among the African-American families who gathered at Union Baptist Church. There, elementary and high school students were encouraged to bring their best school papers and read them aloud in this nurturing setting. Mama said this was a powerful incentive for students to strive for excellence in their schoolwork. In addition to taking pride in reading her work, Mama was impressed with the adults in charge of the Culture Club, 2 brothers-in-law, Colonel Otis B. Duncan of the 8th Illinois Regiment of the Illinois National Guard, and physician S.A. Ware. There were 2 things that she associated with these men for the rest of her life, and I mean literally for the rest of her life, as my husband will attest to. Mama used to speak of Colonel Otis B. Duncan as, just someone she had such respect for. The thing that she associated him with is how smart he looked in his uniform. And the other was the fact that Dr. Ware's wife, Mrs. Clara Duncan Ware, was a descendant of Lincoln's Haitian barber, William de Floraville, and that she had inherited the mirror that once hung on the wall in the Palace Barber Shop. That is how I first learned of Billy the Barber's mirror, having grown up hearing my mother's account and later finding written references to Mrs. Ware's possession of the mirror. I was intrigued by the thought of all the people who would have been reflected in the historic mirror. Being a writer of children's book with deep interest in history, I couldn't resist writing the story. And so now I will read it to you. And I taught 2nd grade in my first life, so after I read a page, I'll hold it up. Abraham Lincoln stepped down from the barber's chair and looked into the beautifully framed mirror on the wall. Standing there, he could see his reflection and that of everyone and everything in the room. He was in the elegant barber shop known as the Palace. It was the popular meeting place where Illinois politicians and Springfield businessmen met to hear and announce the latest news. The Palace was like Abraham Lincoln's second home. He often went there to swap stories with the owner, William de Floraville, and with other patrons to make new business contacts and to discuss current events. William de Floraville, better known by his nickname Billy the Barber, and Abe Lincoln had known each other longer than either of them had known anyone else in Springfield. They met quite by chance. I do want to interrupt my story by saying the exquisite artwork and the design of this book were done by a very modest Linnea Carlson, who's sitting there in the first row and the second seat. And so I just want you to take a moment to give her a hand. It's just beautiful work. Now, getting back to the story. In 1831, de Florville traveled up the Mississippi River to the Illinois and Sangamon River. When he reached the village of New Salem, he met a tall stranger by the name of Abraham Lincoln. The two men struck up a conversation. Upon learning that his new acquaintance was a barber who'd run out of money on his way to Springfield, Lincoln took de Florville to the Rutledge Tavern boarding house, where he earned enough money from giving haircuts to continue on to Springfield the next day. Excuse me. Arriving in New Salem was the end of a long journey for William de Florville, whose travels had begun in Cape Haitian, Haiti, in about 1806, the year of his birth. For many years, the labor of enslaved Africans had made Haiti one of France's richest colonial possessions in North America. During the American Revolution, a force of 545 free black Haitians joined forces with George Washington in the Battle of Savannah to help American colonists win independence from England. About 5 years before de Florville was born, Toussaint L'Ouverture, a former slave and soldier, led the revolution against the French in Haiti that abolished slavery on that Caribbean island. In 1804, Haiti gained its independence, making it the second free republic in the Americas. Many historians believe the loss of this important possession was the main reason that France was willing to sell the Louisiana Purchase, over 800,000 square miles, from which the states of Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and parts of 7 other states were formed, to the United States for less than 5 cents per acre. Like many other Haitians, de Florville was Catholic. His godmother brought him to St. Mary's Convent in Maryland, where he attended school. When his godmother died, he became an apprentice in a barber shop. After becoming a skilled barber, de Florville left Baltimore and traveled to New Orleans, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Missouri. He thought that since these cities had been under French rule, that they would be a lot like Haiti. Instead, he found that both of these cities were dangerous places for a free man of color. He was born in Haiti, born free in Haiti, but in those two cities he could be seized and sold into slavery. Because of this, he set out for Springfield, Illinois, where Dr. Elias Merriman, whom he had known in Baltimore, now lived. It was during that trip that he met Abraham Lincoln. In Springfield, de Florville met and married Phoebe Roundtree, and he opened the first and only barber shop in town, in quotes, a new building opposite the north front of the State House. De Florville named his barber shop the Palace, and he called himself the Barber King of the village. Goods and services were much less expensive then than they are now. For example, de Florville charged 15 cents for cutting men's and boys' hair, 20 cents for cutting girls' hair, and $15 a year for a shave. One of the things he did to make the palace look regal was to hang a beautiful mirror on the wall. His patrons enjoyed how good they looked after getting a haircut or shave. Many admired the mirror as much as they admired their new haircuts. Naturally, when Abraham Lincoln moved to Springfield in 1837, he came to the palace. Lincoln and de Florville had many stories to share, including how much they or how they first met, and all the things they had done in the meantime. In the years since meeting de Florville, meeting de Florville had been very eventful for Lincoln. He had piloted a flatboat to New Orleans, and he had served in the Illinois legislature before the state capital moved from Vandalia to Springfield at Lincoln's suggestion. But the Lincoln accomplishment that would have the most meaning for de Florville was that Lincoln had become a licensed lawyer, and he soon became de Florville's lawyer. De Florville was thrifty and became one of the wealthiest men in Springfield. In addition to his barber shop, he opened the first dry cleaning business in town. He also invested in property. At one time, he owned almost an entire city block, 8th Street to 9th Street on Washington in downtown Springfield. References to real estate transactions that Lincoln made on de Florville's behalf can be found in Lincoln's correspondence. De Florville was noted for his generosity and his social consciousness. He shared his wealth with his church, with other churches, and with individuals who were in need of money. He led a movement to establish a school for black children, which would be supported by the taxes their parents paid. He was noted for his musical talents and often played flute and violin at social gatherings, but what he was best known for was his skill as a barber. Most pictures of his best-known patron, Abraham Lincoln, show Lincoln wearing a beard. However, Lincoln was beardless for the 23 years between his arrival in Springfield in 1837 and 1860. De Florville would give him a shave whenever he went to the palace. Then, on October 15, 1860, soon after Lincoln became a candidate for the presidency, he received a letter from a little girl named Grace Bedell. Grace was an 11-year-old girl who lived in Westfield, New York. In her letter, she wrote, "I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway, and if you will let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you." This is how Abraham Lincoln answered Grace's letter. "As to the whiskers, never having worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I were to begin it now? It can't be said for certain whether this correspondence is what led Lincoln to begin to grow a beard, but what is known for certain is that he did grow a beard and he did win the presidency." By the end of 1861, Lincoln posed for his first picture wearing a beard. Undoubtedly, William de Florville was the very first barber to ever trim Lincoln's famous beard. His first portrait with the beard was made shortly before Abraham Lincoln left for Springfield to become the 16th President of the United States. On February 11, 1861, he made his farewell address at the Great Western Station and boarded a train for Washington. This was the last time he and de Florville would ever see each other. However, Lincoln's longtime friendship with de Florville gave him the firsthand experience of knowing a hard-working and civic-minded black man. It may have influenced his decision to recognize Haiti's independence and receive the minister from Haiti with full diplomatic honors. In September 1862, the preliminary version of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation was published. It went into effect on January 1st, 1863. In response, nearly 200,000 black men joined the Union Army and Navy troops and fought valiantly in the Civil War. Lincoln declared that their service was a crucial force. Keep it, and you can save the Union. Throw it away, and the Union goes with it. Just after Christmas of 1863, William de Florville, using the spelling Florville, sent a beautifully handwritten letter to Abraham Lincoln. In it, he expressed his thoughts on the Emancipation Proclamation and his hope that Lincoln would be reelected. On a personal note, de Florville wished Lincoln a speedy recovery from a recent illness and told of his surprise at learning of the death of Lincoln's son, Willie. De Florville included details about his own family and his barbering business. He also provided news that the dog, Fido, that had belonged to Lincoln's sons was doing well, and he reassured Lincoln that their Springfield home was being well cared for. William de Florville never recovered from the shock of Abraham Lincoln's death just a few days after the end of the Civil War. Upon his own death, he left all of his personal property to his wife. Upon her death, the real estate holdings were divided equally among their 5 children. William and Phoebe de Florville's great-granddaughter, Mrs. Clara Ware, eventually inherited the beautiful mirror that had once reflected the image of Abraham Lincoln and everyone and everything else in the palace. And that's the end of the story. However, once you're a teacher, you may retire, but you never recover. And so when Linnea and I found wonderful documents and pictures of Lincoln and the de Florvilles, we couldn't resist including a section called Billy's Scrapbook. And so this section includes photographs and a chronology that was developed by Margaret Collins of the de Florville family from 1806 to 1871. Here, it's pictures of Lincoln with and without the beard, and a number of wonderful documents, including that letter that was referred to earlier this afternoon, and also the wedding certificate of Mr. and Mrs. de Florville. So, and then at the very end is the skit that you heard premiered here, and so that's what's in the book. And thank you.
Well, don't have very much to say, but I would like to ask the descendants if you have anything that you would like to say to us or any little tidbits of family stories that you folks have.
I just wanted to say, growing up as a child, we always heard about Billy the Barber, and Billy didn't mean a whole lot other than he was Lincoln's barber, and that was kind of it. And then about 3 years ago, my uncle, who since passed away, my mother's brother, contacted my mom and said, there's somebody in Oklahoma sending information, has all about the family, a family tree, and don't know where it came from. I told my son Mario, who's a history teacher here in town, and like the next day he gets a phone call, and this man says, I'm your so-and-so cousin once removed, blah, blah, and I'm coming to town. And so Mario said, what's this all about? So I told my mom, Rita, and we decided to have them over for dinner. Didn't know them from Adam or anything like that. And it was Gary, she mentioned her, Gary and Pam Rollins, who I really wish they would be here because they brought so much information about our family and to us, and we've learned more and more. Anyway, Gary and Pam, they came for dinner, and he had books. They've done so much research on the family and everything like that. And he has videotapes and you name it, he's got it. And they gave us these wonderful books with a chronology of each side of the family and how we're all related. The Willises are on one part of the family, and the Smiths, etc. Anyway, he said how he stumbled on it was he's always been fascinated by Lincoln. And he was at dinner one night, and his mother was there. And he says, I'm going to Springfield. And he'd been here before. And his mother made the comment, well, don't be surprised if you don't see the family name somewhere. And then she shut up. He said, what do you mean by that? Well, she wouldn't say any more about it. So Pam started doing some investigating and discovered that he was related to William Florville. Well, throughout his childhood and in his adult life, he'd been brought up white. And that's what he always thought his family background was. His grandfather opened the first dry cleaners in the state of Arkansas in Little Rock across from Central High School. And as a child, he used to go to visit his grandfather and said they had signs up that said colored and white. He thought that meant the clothes. You know, he's a child, he didn't know any difference speaking. And so the more and more he investigated, well, anyway, you probably all have seen that famous picture when they were integrating Central High School. And there was a man there with a white hat that was making fun and yelling at this black girl trying to get into the school. That was his grandfather. And so, like I said, more and more information around Gary and Pam has just been absolutely fascinating. The relationship as far as Otis B. Duncan, like she brought up earlier, didn't know that. I remember as a child going to Aunt Clara's house and sitting on the porch, remember it being a big house, and she was a big woman. And I can remember that. And my mom would always tell different little stories. And then my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Thomas Jordan Richardson, lived on Capitol Avenue. And his brother, George Richardson, is that right, Mom? Okay. His brother, George Richardson, was accused of raping the white woman back in the 1900s that started the Springfield race riot. And he was later she recanted, and fortunately he was not killed like the other gentleman was, but he was sent to Bloomington. And later on, George died and became a janitor. I think he did get to move back to Springfield. And that started the formation of the NAACP. And that was, again, something I didn't know anything about, but eventually we did find out about that. And I'm trying to think what else did we find out about our family. But it's just been really fascinating, especially these last few years, all the information that's come out. And I'm very proud of my family and what they've accomplished and how much history that there is in Springfield and what they brought to not only my life, but to my children and my grandchildren, and how fortunate we are. The first Catholic Mass was said in Springfield at Willie's house. And my parents weren't raised as Catholic, but they decided to send us to Catholic schools, and eventually then they became Catholic too. So I have a lot of history there as well. And I'm just glad to say that we're really very fortunate with the history that we have, and I'm really appreciative to Pam and Gary for all the information and continuing, because every time we see them, they find out some more information and say, you're related to so-and-so, and it's like, okay, fine. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know that.
It isn't every day we get to meet folks like that who have such a fascinating family history, especially for those of us who live right here in beautiful downtown Springfield. Well, we are about at the end of our program, but I do have a couple of other things to say. The marriage license that was referenced, if you look over on the table against the wall, we have the original there, and it should be here when I leave this room. Thank you very much. We also have the last will and testament that was mentioned. That's over there. And there is another document in reference to William Florville also. And please, when you're looking at it, pay attention to his very fine handwriting. It's really gorgeous, really gorgeous. I thank you all for coming today. It is now 3:25. I don't want to go on too much longer, but I will be here If anyone has questions, I think Gail might be here for a little while, and Gwinnett might be here for a while as well. And maybe we can have just some conversation amongst ourselves. I do thank you all for coming. In closing, I would like to say that you have an evaluation. We would like for you to fill it out and return it to Angela. Angela, wave your hand. Or leave it out on the table in the foyer. And I thank you very much. And I have one other person to acknowledge who's standing up, Jerry Blakely from the African American History Museum. Charlotte Johnson. Thank you all very much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned, and I hope it piques your interest in learning more about your own family history and about the history of Springfield and Mr. Lincoln also. And thank you very much.